Where's the other half of that graph though? I've never been relaxed in my entire life. It's reflected in my book tastes. Hey y'all, welcome back to the Book Stamp. I'm Kate, and today I'm going to be going through sort of a statistical analysis of all of the books I read in 2020. I just released sort of my 2020 wrap up, every single book that I read video, so go check that out if you haven't already watched it. And in that video, I sort of did a micro look at all the books I read, is that I looked at every single individual book, sort of did a really quick rapid fire reaction to all of them. But in this video, I wanted to sort of zoom out a little bit, look at some of the overarching themes of what I read last year, and from the data that I keep track of, to better look at reading things that I do like and how we can take all this data and like figure stuff out about ourselves or myself, and also my reading taste and sort of where gaps are in my reading. I am a scientist by nature. I love looking at data. I actually, for this year, created my own spreadsheet, which was good. I really enjoyed that, but moving forward into 2020, I now use sort of one of the really common booktube spreadsheets. I'll link it down below because I can't remember. I got it from somebody's video who got it from somebody's video who got it from like the original person, so it just tracks a lot more things that I wanted to track and was working on building into my spreadsheet. So for this, pretty much all of my stats are coming from either my own personal spreadsheet that I have or the Storygraph, because that's where I track all of my books. I don't use Goodreads. So that's pretty much where all of my statistics are coming from. So starting off, we'll start with the Storygraph. So I'm going to pop all of the pie graphs and everything up on the screen, but I have a physical copy in front of me to reference when filming, so if I'm looking down, like, that's why. It's not because I just like looking at my feet. So for the year of 2020, I set a reading goal of 100 books, and I read 123, so I read 123% of my reading goal. That is some pretty easy math to do. So originally I'd set a goal of like 40 books for the year, but basically once quarantine hit and I had a lot less commitments in my life, I bumped it up to 100 and I surpassed that. I don't know that I will ever read that many books again. We'll see for this year with BookTube, like, what that's gonna mean for me, but I am really proud of that number. And for those 123 books, I ended up reading 40,118 pages. So that number doesn't really mean anything. I think it is much more useful to know the average book length. So that's, I have that somewhere. Yeah, so that ended up being 329 pages per book, which is pretty good. I think that's honestly kind of on the higher end. I would in 2021, I'm trying to get it up closer to 400. That's really where I'd like it, because also I just want to read a lot more fantasy, like especially larger fantasy books and fantasy series. That's a goal of mine for this year. So I am hoping to be a little bit more intentional about what I read, and not necessarily, in 2020 I read just a lot of like fluff, and I want to be a lot more intentional this year, and so I think that will be reflected in the page count. We'll see. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's what's going to happen, but that's the goal. One of the other things the Storygraph does that's really cool is they sort of break the books down by mood, so like the main mood of the book. And what was really interesting to me was that my number 1 and number 2 moods were reflective and emotional. And I do think that I read, I mean, obviously the data says this, but I read a lot more like literary fiction, a lot more introspective books this year. That's something I found that I really like and had not read a lot of in the past. So that's definitely something that I am looking like is really interesting to be reflected. Next is adventurous. Obviously, I read a lot of like fantasy adventures, so like that's not super surprising. Challenging and dark then are next. So again, with that sort of sad, somber tone. 2020 was a interesting, rough year for a lot of us. I was also hella depressed. I think that's reflected in my book taste. Then we have mysterious and informative. Then we have lighthearted. I did read more lighthearted than sad books. So like that's a positive. That's a positive. Funny, inspiring, hopeful, not a lot of. Tense. I don't really like thrillers at all. Discovered that this year. The few I read I did not like. And then lastly, relaxing. I've never been relaxed in my entire life. It's reflected in my book tastes. Next we have the pace of the books. So medium pace was far and away the biggest chunk, kind of equal fast and slow. That's really what I like. I think that's a really good mix for me. I find that a lot of YA and younger stories for younger readers are more fast-paced, and my slow is my much more literary fiction, and so I kind of like to have an equal number of those, and then the medium in the middle. This is one that I do find really interesting, where the page number, so I did not read a lot of books that are over 500 pages, because I didn't really read a lot of like huge fantasy series in 2020, and the fantasy that I did read was YA fantasy, which is normally more in the 300 to 499 range, and less than 300 was really, I think, surprisingly large, but I think that's because a lot of literary fiction comes in at like 280, 290 pages. And so I think that is why the less than 300 is as large as it is. Interesting. That's one that I find that I really like to track and keep track of, like on almost a book by book basis, because I think it's really interesting. The fiction nonfiction breakdown, honestly, I feel like that's a lot of nonfiction for me. I did read quite a bit of poetry and plays though, and the Storygraph does count those as nonfiction. So that is a good chunk of that, but I also feel like I read a lot more nonfiction than I normally do. So then we just have our sort of genre breakdown. And one thing that's important to note for this is books can be categorized as multiple things. So there's a lot of books in the fantasy and the sci-fi category, a lot of things that are in like contemporary and LGBTQ, like the books show up in both. So like if you sum all these up, it's more than 123. But from this, you can see that I read 40 fantasy books, followed by the next category of young adult, then contemporary and science fiction. Science fiction and historical were equal. That's really interesting, because I would consider myself a science fiction reader. I would not consider myself a historical reader. But last year I read a lot of like weird books in the middle of the year when I was in a weird headspace. So I think that's when a lot of the historical came in. LGBTQ books, romance. Don't really consider myself a romance reader, but it's pretty high up there. Classics and poetry, memoir, feminism. Everything else is kind of just like ones. So that is interesting. I really like how they do the next graph, which is comparing the number of books and pages, which everyone who's shown this plot, I think it's really interesting, because it's like, when did quarantine start? Huge spike. Where January and February, I was like really stressed at work, and so I didn't read as much. And then in March, quarantine shut down. I pretty much like wasn't really working. Huge spike. In April, I read a lot of books, but a lot less read a lot less book, but a lot more pages. So I read a bunch of long books in April. In the summer months, we kind of have a general trough, which kind of makes sense. That you see that a lot for a lot of people in the summer when just things get busier. That was when quarantine kind of ended. So a lot of my stuff did start back in like safe ways. So where I was doing some things, but not like lockdown, literally not leaving my house like I was in March and April. August and September were when I started working a lot again, but we don't really see a reflection of that. November was when I graduated, so there is a dip there. And then December I was unemployed, so there's a huge spike again. So I do find that really interesting. And we had February where the pages in the book number were like really close. But other than that, I did a pretty good job of reading like long books, I think. And then finally, we just have my star ratings. So the thing it's important to note for this is before I started my booktube channel, I was much more lenient with my 5 stars. So that's why there's a lot more of them. Also, I did not switch to the Storygraph until probably October. And so that's when the half stars were actually counted. So that's why all of those are kind of really small. But you can see overall, my average rating was a 3.96. That's really, really high. And I had a lot of 5 and 4 star books. I read a lot of really good books. There were some months where I didn't, but for the most part, I read a lot of really, really good books that I really liked. So, all right. So those were all of the like automatic calculated statistics from the Storygraph. So I have all of those from their website that they curate for you. we also have sort of the book form, so how I read the book. This is something that I kept track of. And I read a lot of audiobooks in 2020. Like, what is that? 52% of my reading was via audiobook. And for a huge reason for that is that my library was like straight up shut down in the beginning of, like, right when quarantine started, and then at the end of the year as well. So I like could not get books. And then for the bulk of the year, it was really only, you could only reserve books on the website. So, and you can only reserve 8 at a time, which from other people that I've seen on like Bookstagram and stuff, like that's really low. And I really like to just like go and browse the shelves, see what's new, what's not on my radar. And so there were a lot of times where I just wasn't really reading a lot of physical books for that reason. So I read a lot of audio. Also, there was a period in quarantine when I was not going into work anymore, but my partner had to go to work for his job. And so I was home alone, like all day, every day. And I really hated just like being alone by myself. So I'd like put on an audiobook to like feel like I had other people with me and I wasn't just alone all the time. I hope other people do that too, so I don't sound like a psychopath. But yeah, so I read a lot of audiobooks, which was over 50% of my reading. Physical was next at 32, like roughly 32% of my reading. And then finally ebook at 15%. Ebook is my least favorite way to read a book. So I go through phases with ebooks, but I really, really prefer a physical book or an audiobook. The way that I did some of the stats this year was like, it's really, really difficult to track if an author is queer. Because I just got to the point where I was like scouring author websites, trying to figure it out. It can be weird to like, I felt like I was like really invading people's privacy, trying to figure out if they were queer or not. And it's really hard, like you're making assumptions, and it just kind of got to a point where I felt kind of icky doing it. And it was also difficult, and I did not feel like half of them were I didn't really feel accurate in a lot of them. And so I decided to stop doing that. So then I just basically tracked if a book had queer representation in it, because that's a lot easier. If the book has queer representation in it, check. Which there is Yes Star, which that is all solely for Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Robertson. I go on a whole rant about it in my like worst books of the year thing about how there's a bisexual male main character, and I was so excited, but there's literally just like one throwaway line about him being bi, and it's like bad representation. I was not here for it. So that one got a Yes Star. And none of the others really had enough like questionable representation to make in that category, but that one just really grinded my gears for some reason. But from that you can see that, where's the other half of that graph though? Almost 40% of the books had queer representation. So I like feel pretty good about that. 40% of the books that I read were queer. I would love that to be higher this year, but I'm not really tracking it in that way this year just because I think it's just not really a good way to track that metric, so I'm not tracking it anymore. But I feel like I read enough queer lit that that's not something that I need to track to make sure I do, for me personally. So I feel pretty good about that. And then I have the gender of the authors that I read, where 73, almost 74% of the authors that I read were women. So wave a little girl power flag. That is just, partially because of reading YA books, because the majority of YA books are written by women. And then also just the issues that I care about in the world typically are cared about by women. So I did read 20% of the books that I read that were written by male authors, and then 3% were by male-female, like dual author pairs. So Aurora Rising and This Is How You Lose the Time War are the two that come to mind that were written by like male and female author pairs. And then queer authors was 3% as well. So those are either people that identify as, I think it's all people that identify as non-binary are included in the queer label for this, which is people who use they them pronouns. I'm going to break it down a lot more this year for that. So and read a lot more queer authors as well, so that's really exciting. But I would absolutely love to see more booktube people break their author gender down by more than male and female, because more than male and female exists. And if you don't need to, that means you're not reading queer authors, and you probably should be. You heard it here first, just kidding. People have been saying it a lot longer than I have. And then we also have the race and ethnicity plot. So one of the things I wanted to do was compare the breakdown of the authors that I'm reading to the breakdown of the United States. While I am reading books from around the world, I do live in the United States, so I wanted to at least compare my metrics to those of the United States to at least accurately reflect the country that I live in. And I did okay. I didn't do great, but I did okay because I read 66% white authors, and 60% of the United States is white. So I'm pretty close. I would, of course, really prefer to be on the other side of close, where I'm reading more authors of color. And so the Black authors that I read was 15 to 16%, and 13% of the US is Black. So I did better on that metric for sure. So the area that I definitely was not representative in was Hispanic authors. So I read 5% Hispanic authors, and Hispanic people make up 18% of the United States. So didn't do great there. That's definitely my area of improvement for this year. That is one of the things that I have. If you look at my 2021 goals video, I've already addressed it there. But I do want to be fully transparent about the statistics and the statistical breakdown of the books that I'm reading. So that is how much I failed by of my goal. For Asian authors, I read 9% of the books I read were by Asian authors, and Asian authors make up 6% of the United States. So I did pretty good there. And then we have two or more ethnicities, which I didn't really track that. I know there were definitely some authors that I read that were two or more ethnicities, but I think I just logged them under either the one that they usually are categorized in bookstores or is on the back flap. So that's something just for me, I think I should be more, just look for more. For Native American and Alaska Native is 1.3%, and I read 3.3% of the books that I read were by Native authors. And then on this chart as well, we have Native Hawaiian or other, which I did not read any books by Native Hawaiian authors. But I definitely have some on my shelf, so that's something I should read this year. Yeah, I think those are all of the stats that I have. Oh, just some more interesting things. Let's see, the longest book I read was To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini, which came in at 880 pages. The shortest book I read was The Poetry of Sappho, which was 54 pages, I want to say. So yeah, those are all of the statistical breakdown of all the books that I read this year. I hope you found this interesting. I always find people's very, very interesting and looking at them. So I hope you find them interesting too. Thanks for hanging out, y'all.